Hey everyone, RogueGold here, and today we're diving back into the world of The Division 3. Now, before we get into this, I wanted to wish you all a happy holidays, however you may be spending your time or celebrating. For any watching in the future, I am posting this on Christmas Day, and that is somewhat significant because that means today marks the 5-year anniversary of the first ever Division 3 video that I released here on the channel. That's right, 5 years ago, little old me was sitting there dreaming of a future where The Division 3 was a reality. And here we are. It is surreal to finally be able to say that yes, while I am here writing out and working on this video, there is a team assembled and actively developing Tom Clancy's The Division 3 at Massive Entertainment. Now, to be fair, this isn't new news, right? They announced that The Division 3 was in the plans back in 2023, and at the time, I released a 45-minute ultimate wish list for what I would hope to see from the game. But I figured, hey, it's been well over a year since then. We know that the game is no longer just a concept or on paper, they're working on it every day, so why not revisit the subject and try to pare down my list to just 10 things. 10 wish list items that I hope to see most from Tom Clancy's The Division 3. It wasn't easy. As a franchise fan since day one, there is a lot that I'm hoping for from this game, but it was a fun challenge and I'm excited to dive into this. Before we do, after you're done hearing my list, I would love for you all to write out your 10 most important wish list items if it were up to you to make The Division 3. And don't be shy to include some hot takes or whatever other self-preferences you might have for how you wish the devs would handle this franchise. My list certainly won't appeal to everybody, and that's why it's my list. So let's get the conversation going, and I look forward to reading through your guys' reactions, ideas, and lists down in the comments below. Lastly, if you end up enjoying the video, and you want to stay up to date on the latest with The Division 3 and the Division franchise at large, or, you just want to spread some holiday cheer, then I would be very appreciative of you clicking that subscribe button. I've got some big goals and plans for the channel heading into 2025. With that all being said, and without further ado, let's dive into my 10 biggest hopes for The Division 3. Do note that this list is in no particular order of importance or preference. I simply picked 10 things that I would want to see most from the game, and my placements for 1 through 10 simply came down to if I thought certain topics would flow well from one to the next. Beginning with number 1, we have a legendary campaign. A big critique that many held for the Division 2's launch and campaign experience, at least compared to the Division 1's, was how campaign missions were relegated to a single story difficulty. Now, not only was story a relatively easy experience for franchise veteran players, but it simply reduced how much choice and agency players had. Back in the Division 1, every campaign mission had a normal or hard difficulty that you could select between, and hard could definitely be hard, especially if you were under-leveled, but it was up to the player to make that choice. And I'll tell you, some of my most memorable experiences from my early days in the Division 1 was how in over our heads my friends and I would be when we were leveling up our characters. Now, the idea for a legendary campaign specifically comes from how Destiny 2 has implemented some of its most recent expansion campaigns, where when you begin the campaign, you get to choose whether you want to tackle it from a more relaxed and narrative-driven difficulty, or you want a true gameplay test as well by selecting legendary. Now, you do have the option to scale back to normal at any time during the campaign should it prove to be too difficult. However, completing all campaign missions on legendary not only gave players immense self-satisfaction and some highly memorable boss fights and gameplay experiences, but the developers also made it so that you would be awarded with a high-tier gear kit upon reaching the endgame, effectively making the legendary campaign a fast track to skipping some of the early endgame grind. Mix in some exclusive cosmetics on top of that formula, and I think the Division 3 has a fantastic opportunity to bake this idea directly into the core game's DNA and create a fantastic parallel progression path for those veteran and more hardcore players that want to go all out for this game's release. Number 2, a shared and expanded open world. If you've played either of the Division games before, I think the vast majority agree that their open worlds and how the developers go about recreating these real-life locations is one of the most impressive, immersive, and stunning aspects of the games. It's because of that fact that I've always been shocked at how little long-term investment or replayability emphasis is placed on this content. Now, certainly the Division 2 did a lot to expand on the open world's incentive and features compared to the Division 1, but what I'm proposing goes much farther. Akin to how the upcoming mobile spinoff, The Division Resurgence, is handling its open world, I want to see a Division 3 where I can head out to explore the city and randomly come across other friendly shade agents as I do. Whether or not we want to go our separate ways or tag along with one another to go and take on an objective, totally up to us, but it's that freedom and social possibility that excite me. I believe this would also satisfy the crowd of players who have long requested a PvE Dark Zone, an idea which I have always pushed back on, but perhaps the most exciting element to this is that it would open the door for all new levels of scale and dynamic content out in the open world. If running into and grouping up with 5, 6, 7 or more players is an option, then the devs could explore adding in much larger open world activities than we've ever seen. How about heavily armored convoys making their way from one side of the map to the other in an armored APC? Maybe such an activity would be nearly impossible to tackle solo, but if you get a few agents or squads to coordinate with you, there could be some epic loot waiting on the other side. However they might go about capitalizing on it, I think shifting the open world to a shared environment would open the door to many new and replayable opportunities. Moving on to number 3, One Dark Zone. This one is pretty self-explanatory. The Division 2 launched with 3 separate smaller DZs, and myself along with a majority of players agree that we would love to see things return to the singular vast Dark Zone of the original game. On top of just reclaiming that magic, seeing the devs lean even more into making the DZ unpredictable and lethal would be awesome, like having more frequent and varied limited time events like the Division 1 subway contaminations. You could have periods of SHD blackout where you lose access to your HUD and skills. There's truly endless possibilities there, but that all starts by having an exciting, unpredictable, and rewarding singular endgame Dark Zone. At number 4, I've got dynamic seasons and weather. Similarly to their open world magnificence, the Division games are often remembered by their distinct seasonal choices. The Division 1 in the dead of winter and the Division 2 in the heat of summer. Those selections and themes certainly leave lasting impressions, but what if the Division 3 didn't have to pick just one? Introducing a system or capability for the developers to rotate through all 4 seasons of the year could be a huge boon for game freshness and simply visual variety. Watching a city go from leaf piles to snowpacks to blossoming flowers would not only be a very neat transition to watch, but they could tie those elements into the gameplay. And having this capability would greatly help with narrative chronology, an issue that the Division 2 is currently facing, where the game's hot summer aesthetic has begun clashing with the in-game timeline where things are meant to be transitioning back to the winter. So while yes, like many, I would hope to see snow back in the Division 3, just like back in the Division 1, I hope that they take things one step further and allow all seasons to have their time in the sun. For number 5, I've got new weapon types. This one's pretty simple. I want to use some new stuff to kill some new bad guys. The Division 2 flirted with the idea of adding new weapons. We technically did get the new rifle class, although single-shot weapons already did exist in the Division 1, and specialization weapons saw us getting to use, albeit on a limited basis, some more unique options like a crossbow and a flamethrower, but I hope that the Division 3 leans more into a wider variety of regular weapon selections. Of course, we'll see our standard assault rifles, snipers, and shotguns, but what if we also had access to compound bows or melee weapons? Adding these options, while I'm sure it is a ton of work, would do a lot, I think, to make this new entry in the series distinct from its predecessors, give longtime players some new exciting toys to play with, and simply add more variety, which I don't ever see as being a bad thing. Sticking with loot overall, at number 6 I've got Gear 3.0. Now, technically we have had several iterations of the gear system across both the Division 1 and 2. The Division 1 did a pretty hefty revamp at one time, taking things closer to a 1.5 version, I would say. The Division 2, on the other end, has had 2 very distinct iterations. And it's mostly because we currently use Gear 2.0 in the Division 2 that leads me to calling for a 3.0 in the Division 3. Loot and build making is core to what has made so many players fall in love with and stick with the Division games over the past 8 years. And while the Division 2's current gear system is not objectively bad by any stretch, from mine and many other veteran player perspectives, it simply lacks some of that depth and creativity that we remember from back in the day. Having elements like certain stats being exclusive to certain items, talents being more widely available on more items, talent requirements being present to help keep balancing more in check. These are things that are all sorely missed by many under the current gear system iteration. And while I know it is not an easy task to develop a gear system that works for intricate PvE and PvP content, in fact I would guess that that is one of the most complex jobs that the developers have had on these games, it is a vital component for making these games work. And so, for the third game, I hope we see the team take one more crack at delivering a system that has intuitiveness, depth, and the necessary checks and balances for endgame content. Following up with that, at number 7, we have in-game build features. Part of the complexity to making a good gear system, as we've seen over the years, is having it be deep enough to interest players in the long term, while still having it be approachable and comprehensible for newer players. One element that can help alleviate some of that confusion is online guidance and resources. Sites like Reddit and Discord have more active communities, spreadsheets, and other tools to help players theorycraft and better understand build making. Build guides are one of, if not the most popular form of Division content here on YouTube, but I know all too well from being on here, as do many of you I'm sure, that has its flaws. YouTube guides can not only be misleading at times, but also often lack the depth and educational element that really allows viewers to understand why a build works the way that it does, or what the most effective ways to use it in gameplay are. And even tools accessed in other corners of the internet, that is still not a perfect solution, as it requires people to break their immersion and leave the game to try and understand what is going on. What I propose, and what I hope we see in The Division 3, is an infrastructure and systems developed to help players share their wealth of knowledge about builds directly in the game. Once again, the upcoming Division Resurgence spinoff showcased its attempt to tackle this issue in beta tests that were held. In that game, there are entire menus dedicated to showing players different recommended builds with explanations for what the general intention and strength of that build is. They even have it set to where you will be granted some moderate rewards for constructing said recommended builds. That alone could go a long way, I feel, in helping some players of the mainline games better grasp how to fully take advantage of the build systems. But you could even take things one step further by allowing players to upload their builds to a database in-game. Let people share their creations, upvote the ones that they like, and create a community around this shared passion to help others directly within the game. Doing something like this would then allow the developers to make the build system a bit more intricate and in-depth, I feel, as newer players who feel overwhelmed by it would no longer feel forced to pull their phone out in search of answers. It would be available at their fingertips right in-game. That takes us to number 8, Endgame Progression 3.0. I don't know why I like these 3.0s, just because The Division 3, I guess. Anyways, we've seen the Division games pursue endgame progression, perks, and power in a few different ways. The Division 1 opted for a perk chart that you built out as you progressed your character, letting you choose a few different ones once you hit the endgame. The Division 2 initially began with specializations, but in the years since has pursued even more progression paths like your Shade Watch and expertise levels. For The Division 3, I hope to see the developers take another swing in this area. I think there is room to create something with depth and meaningful choice, while also condensing things into one comprehensible system so as not to overwhelm newer and more casual players with 8 different outlets for power once they hit the endgame. Upon reaching the endgame, I visualized there being one large perk tree accessible via your Shade Watch or Isaac Brick. There would be perks and talents in here beneficial to all playstyles and build types, and unlike previous iterations, not every perk in the tree would be selectable, meaning you'd have to choose which paths and perks you find to be most valuable to you and your build, and then at the final tiers of this perk tree and at the end of each respective branch of it, you'd find a range of final ultimate unlocks. Some players have stated that they preferred the signature skills of the Division 1, others the specialization weapons of the Division 2. Why not give them the option between these? Curate a selection of some of the best and most balanced ultimate abilities, and let players choose. Do they want an activatable healing wave? Do they want a TAC 50 sniper rifle that can one-shot enemies? Lots of different things you could do here, but I think keeping things simple while simultaneously leaning into the depth and choice that players have historically responded well to is the right path to choose as far as how to offer meaningful progression in the endgame. And if you wanted to loop this into seasonal content as well, have this perk tree feature an isolated path off to the side that features season-exclusive perks and talents to shake up gameplay every few months. Hope to see some real ingenuity and evolution on this front. Number 9, PvP support. Now, I'm sure this one will ruffle some feathers amongst you watching. Obviously, PvP is not everybody's favorite content, and that's completely okay. As stated, however, this is my personal Division 3 wishlist, and I have no problem in stating that PvP is my favorite part of the Division franchise. That's not to say I don't enjoy, appreciate, and respect the PvE side of things. Hell, I think the raids and incursion are some of the Division 2's finest content, and I would never suggest that a mainline Division entry should focus on PvP more than PvE. PvE is the cornerstone of these games and their content. That all being said, I think many underestimate how much value having a strong and supported PvP corner of the game can bring. Just look at the Division 1, even after some of its final updates balancing missteps, in my opinion, to this day the Dark Zone is one of the most consistently populated pieces of content when you go and revisit the game. Now, unfortunately, the Division 2's PvP team and support for that content with it were reassigned about 6 months after the game's launch back in 2019, meaning since then we've gotten 0 new PvP maps, modes, or major Dark Zone additions. The remaining development team have done their best to manage and balance things where they can, but with them lacking that PvP expertise, it's tough to really commit to that side of the game. Now, we've already talked about seeing a larger, more living and organic Dark Zone in the third game, but alongside that, I imagine a world where the dedicated conflict framework is taken so much further. Support of new map additions for years after launch, regularly rotating limited time modes like 2v2s or template builds only, multiple playlists to choose between like casual, competitive, large-scale battles, etc. There is so much that could be done with PvP in this franchise, and while yes, of course, that won't keep keep every single player invested, it'll keep one very dedicated section of the player base happy. One that has stuck with this franchise despite lack of new content for much longer than I think anyone would have expected. And finally, that takes us to number 10, a long-term plan. One of the greatest sins committed with The Division 2 in my eye was how we learned that Ubisoft and Massive penned the deal to develop Star Wars Outlaws as early as 2019. However, they still needed their full workforce and to stay on The Division 2 until early 2020 for the release of the Warlords expansion. It wasn't until months after that expansion's release that Ubisoft went, this actually sold exceptionally well, and that led them to funding the rebuilding of an all-new development team, an endeavor which saw the game go through a 15-month content drought, and only now, heading into 2025, have they finally built back enough to the point of being ready to release another major addition to the game with the upcoming Brooklyn DLC. Imagine a world where Ubisoft had kept the dev team intact after Warlords' release. What kinds of new modes, stories, and places might we have explored by now had they realized The Division 2's profitability and potential all of those years ago? This is why one of my greatest hopes for The Division 3 is that we don't repeat the same mistake again. This franchise has proved its viability and popularity time and time again, but those things only remain true if you invest fully and faithfully into the IP well after a new game's launch. Imagine a world where The Division 3 has 2 major expansions, each a year apart, greenlit for development when the main game releases. There's going to be bumps in the road during year 1. That is all but inevitable for a release of a new live game on the scale as The Division games are. But bumps do not equate to failure, and to go through the trouble of making a third game on next generation hardware, only to barely support it after a year being out, that would be a major blunder. It would not only leave your fans disappointed, but it would leave countless of millions of dollars on the table. I know that each and every Division fan listening to this can envision a reality where every year we get a new expansion, location, and campaign released for The Division 3, and in between those releases, seasons deliver new replayable game modes, PvP editions, legendary content, exotics, and so much more. Games like World of Warcraft and Destiny have had their glorious times in the sun with these yearly releases and ongoing support. So, Ubisoft, it's time. All you have to do is step up to the plate and take yours. That, my friends, is going to do it for my list of my 10 biggest hopes for The Division 3, delivered straight from my very subjective view on this franchise. I certainly hope you enjoyed this rundown, but please keep in mind that this is purely my view on things, from the perspective of my own preferences and likings within the Division games. So, after hearing my picks, once again, I would love to read through your guys' top 10 lists down in the comments below, and who knows, maybe in a few years we can look back and say that we got a few of these right. That's all I've got for you today, folks. I sincerely appreciate your time watching. Have a very happy holidays, and I will see you in the next one. RogueGold. Ow.